All right, so in this episode of In the East Wing, I am joined by Michael Patrick Mulroy, also known as Mick Mulroy. Mick is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East. He's also a retired CIA Paramilitary Operations Officer in the Special Activities Center and a retired U.S. Marine. Currently, he is the president of FOGBO, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly here, which is a company that enables international humanitarian efforts. He's also a senior fellow for Middle East Institute, an ABC News national security analyst, a co-founder of the Lobo Institute, the co-president of End Child Soldiering, and he's also on the board of advisors for Plato's Academy Center and the Aurelius Foundation, Marcus Aurelius. In this conversation, we delved into a variety of topics. We talked about the Middle East, we talked about Stoicism, and a few other things here and there. So without further ado, let's hear it from the man himself, Mick Mulroy. Mick, it's been, gosh, I don't remember last time we had a conversation together, but I think, this is the third time you're on my show, so I want to welcome you again. Thank you for joining me.
Great to be with you, Abdullah. And I think even since yesterday, a lot has happened. So I'm sure we have a lot to talk about.
Oh yeah,
Things
absolutely.
are happening fast in the world.
Yeah, things are changing. I mean, I think obviously Middle East. That's the core. That's the main focus. And I do also want to say that we'll try, as much as we can to go over a couple of things pertaining to the Middle East, and we'll delve into a little bit of Stoicism here and there. So for those listening,
all right,
yeah, they're gonna get a couple of
gift to me.
yeah. So Mick, you were for a while. You were involved. You worked under Secretary Mattis, right, at the Department of Defense, and you were involved. You were the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. And I'm sure at the time, things were very different than what we're seeing today. So with a regional war perhaps breaking up soon, hopefully not, and with the situation in the Middle East that's very, very intense, what would you say things would sort of look like if you were still involved with the Pentagon? How different would it be? What you would be doing and in terms of pressure and workload, say you're still involved, like it would probably be very different than, since the last time you were in the inside.
Sure. I mean, that is an interesting question. I haven't had that question asked yet. I did work. I had the privilege to work for both Secretary Mattis and Secretary Esper, both great Americans and really cool to work with, to be honest. And as far as what the difference would be, I think one thing that people would find a bit surprising, at least from my perspective, is U.S. foreign policy does change, but doesn't change as much as you think it does, right? And obviously the news is going to highlight the changes, the differences, and not so much what stays the same and remains the same. And I think partly because when people get into power, you have new president, for example, oftentimes they don't know what they don't know. And when they get in there, they think something, they have a preconceived notion of what should change. And then the first intel briefing they get from the CIA, they go, oh, wait, didn't know that. Of course you didn't know that, because especially now, we get a lot of people that come from outside of government, and we have some people that come from outside of government. So I think the first thing I'd say is a lot of U.S. foreign policy stays consistent. People just don't talk about it because what's to talk about? It doesn't make news if you don't change, right? But it's very consistent. And the other part of that is because there is a group of professional policymakers. I'm not a political person. I don't support a party. I'm, middle of the road ideologically, if you will. I essentially took the policy position because, I'm a former Marine. And when General Mattis asked you to do something, you do it, right? Even my son said that. He was a Marine as well. He's like, well, Dad, you don't really have a choice. So you're going to have to put your Montana plans on hold for 2 years. But there is politically appointed policymakers, and then there's policymakers that are consistent across administrations, both at the NSC, at the State Department, and at the Pentagon, and also at Treasury, I imagine, and energy and all that, but I'm more focused on national security type stuff. And they are consistent. And now they ultimately are told, if policy changes, but if policy doesn't change, then the consistency is right there with them. And the history and the knowledge and how everything's transferred from administration to administration, even if it's a Republican to a Democrat to a Republican, stays consistent unless there's a need to change it. So that's the first part of my answer. Second part is, although I was in a senior Pentagon policymaking position, and I had my say, and certainly both secretaries allowed their deputies, assistant secretaries, to have a say in policy. Ultimately, if that wasn't the ultimate decision over at the White House, guess whose opinion doesn't matter? Yeah, mine, right? Or anybody in my position, right? So, and oftentimes that's how it happened, even to the secretary, right? I mean, I'm not telling any secrets. I mean, the secretary resigned in protest Secretary Mattis resigned in protest to the abrupt decision to essentially abandon our partners in the SDF and depart. Although that didn't actually happen, and we still have people with the SDF, but Secretary Mattis felt that type of disloyalty to partners, and I agree with him, was unacceptable. So that shows you that even up to the secretary level, so the cabinet level, ultimately the president's making the decision. So what would be the difference? I think what I would have agreed with and disagreed with from this administration is I have agreed with the U.S. leading the charge on support for Ukraine. Totally. If anything, I would have pushed, and I wasn't in that part of the geo spectrum, but if they were asking me, I would have said, look, there's no reason to drag out giving them F-16s and M1 Abrams, especially since we all know we're going to do it. So rather than have this public debate, let's just do it all at once so these guys can not just survive, they can succeed. But ultimately, when looking at it in total, I think the U.S., President Biden, his secretaries have led the international community in the support that Ukraine deserves. And this odd anti-Ukrainian sentiment on the far right is just baffling to me, how that party of Reagan can now be, in many ways, a pro-Russian element in the political spectrum. Where I would disagree would be the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Both from the perspective that we didn't have to fully withdraw, we were essentially not in combatant roles anymore. And then, of course, how we withdrew was a national embarrassment. And then I have mixed feelings on the Middle East, current Middle East issue with Gaza and stuff, but I'll stop there and see if you have any specifics on that, because it's a broad topic.
Right. It is. Yeah.
Ramble. Yeah.
There's just earlier you mentioned the SDF. Just maybe for our viewers to know, Syrian Democratic Forces. That's what we're referring to. SDF. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So you mentioned Afghanistan, and I think there's earlier. I think this morning I was looking into. I realized there was an article published in 2010 by a professor at Georgetown, and they were talking about how essentially it was trying to say that the model of clear, hold, build, transfer might not be successful. That was, back in 2010, she was writing about the Obama administration's decision to, it's to sort of to mitigate, I guess, American presence and to after you're done with the insurgency, just transfer it to, the Afghans, let them handle it. You see maybe a sort of a parallel, maybe, with perhaps the tactics that are maybe being used by the IDF in Gaza, right? Maybe would that be considered a counterinsurgency model? And if it would be, what are they maybe perhaps overlooking, or can they fall into a similar situation to that where you find yourself on the ground for almost 20 years and then you realize this is not going anywhere?
Well, to start with, Abdullah, I mean, hopefully all countries have the capacity to learn from other countries' experiences, right? That's the definition of intelligence for me, is the ability to learn from other people's mistakes. I think the U.S., and it's easy to be an armchair quarterback looking back, so I'll start with that. And I spent 2.5 years on the ground in Afghanistan. Looking back, I'd say going forward, the U.S. definitely had a reason to go into Afghanistan. Obviously, the terrorist group Al Qaeda was essentially housed there and protected by the Taliban that did 9/11. I think the U.S., and I did think this at the time, should have focused primarily on the mission that brought us there, which was counterterrorism. We should have built the capacity of Afghans to fight their own terrorist component, to have their own elections. And then we should have just been part of the international community when it comes to building up the country, right? Nation building, right. But not the sole country, and basically take 90% of our international aid and put it into one country, right? I think the international community should have led that. We should have participated. We should have contributed our fair share, but we essentially went all in, and then turned it over to the very group that housed the Al Qaeda terrorist group that attacked us, and they are worse than they ever were. And their human rights record to date is abysmal. In fact, it's probably worse than it was before we got there after the attacks. So I think what the U.S. should learn is we have to realize the reason why we go into a country, and we have to be hesitant to do so only when necessary. Iraq would be a good example of what not to do, right? Try to attach it to 9/11 and then just decide to invade a country. But Afghan, I think, was valid. But then have a realistic goals of what can be done, because if you leave and it collapses because they can't, for example, this is a logistic thing. So if you build all these places that have to be continuously resupplied by aerial delivery, and you know that's not going to last past the United States, like it's a virtual certainty. That's a simple example. But if you're thinking like, I'm trying to build a nation, but I'm building it off of my model, including the military, and then when we're not here, that model can't sustain itself, it's a waste of time, unless you intend to be there forever, which we don't. So I would say from that perspective, we should have very much refined our goals. We should have participated in the international community's effort to have a elected government and that promotes human rights, but not be the primary, because we should be doing that everywhere, and we can't do it everywhere for the focus. But on your question, Abdullah, on whether the Israelis, they're not going to build anything. From my experience, and I'm involved with the humanitarian efforts, enabling humanitarian efforts on the ground there and in other countries, and it does look like their plan right now is, clear for sure, hold somewhat. They're having to re-clear a lot of places. Build, I haven't seen any of that. And then turn over, that's the other issue they're unlikely to do, because from their perspective, they don't see any form of government that's worth handing anything over to. They're certainly not going to do it to a remnant of Hamas's rule. So the build part, the clear part is clearly going on. The hold, to a lesser extent, and then the other two, build and turn over. There's no plan, to my knowledge, and I haven't seen it coming from anybody, to do the latter two.
Ooh. And you said you were involved in the humanitarian effort, and knowing that there might not be, past phase 2 of holding, which is sort of, not it's not concrete yet. The plans to hold, knowing that past that phase, there's nothing to no positive indications. How does that sort of translate when you're involved in this humanitarian effort that that will remain ongoing without perhaps an end goal, right? Like, how did what do you? Yeah, that's a rough position to be in.
That's a good question.
Yeah,
it is like, so from the humanitarian, and we enable humanitarian groups to do what they do in Gaza, and proud to do so. But from that perspective, it does mean that there is essentially no end in sight with the need in Gaza, right? The 80+% of the buildings and dwellings have been destroyed to the point of they can't be occupied.
yeah.
There is no real means to produce food internally. The hospitals are non-functioning. So this is going to be a permanent humanitarian at the basic level effort in Gaza for the foreseeable future. What could change that? Well, I know people say it. Some people don't want to hear it, but there has to be a diplomatic path toward a solution that ends with two nation states that live peacefully beside each other, of which both the governments are responsive to their people, not a foreign entity like Iran, and are driven to provide a better future economically, security, educationally, to their people. That needs to be the case. And if that's going to require an international effort, right? If we're all expecting this to be done by the Israelis, it's not going to happen. Well, they don't even have the capacity to make it happen. It really does require all the nations in the region to either become actively involved, or in the case of Iran, actively uninvolved, unless they're going to do something positive, which is doubtful. But, led by the Gulf states, the U.S. playing a part, obviously, the European partners playing a part, and really looking at how to get to a place where this isn't just a repetitive recycling conflict, where the goal of the political entities is to simply destroy the other entity or country in the region, Israel. It's easier. I mean, it's easier said than done. I'll start with that. But if you're not even saying it, then we're going nowhere.
Right.
Like, we're not going anywhere. And there's too many entities outside of Gaza, or the West Bank for that matter, who are perfectly fine for using this as their own political, and they don't really care about the lot of the Palestinian people going forward. They would, just like the proxy forces in general, Iran would be fully willing to fight to the last proxy force. Right. And we're seeing that in Hezbollah right now. I mean, I don't think you could see any more of an example of that.
Right.
Anyway, so that's you got to start by setting out where the end state, and then there needs to be an all hands international effort to get to that end state once it's agreed to.
There's now here, I don't know if it's right or accurate to have maybe the U.S. experience as a point of reference, but I'll try here to maybe paint a rough sketch, and you tell me where you would perhaps agree or maybe disagree. So the Israeli operation started in Gaza after October 7th, and then now it is sort of shifting to Lebanon. And you hear the rhetoric, obviously, from many officials in the Israeli government saying that the shift is now toward Lebanon, right? There's a fair bit of, I guess the focus is no longer, even though their operation in Gaza is still ongoing, there's more attention being paid to Lebanon and Hezbollah. And this is sort of reminiscent of, I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but sort of Afghanistan and Iraq, right? You start off with Afghanistan, and then you got 2003 invasion of Iraq, and then you have a surge, and then the focus sort of shifts. And you're sort of torn between these different, fronts. And you don't, it's like you're managing two wars at once, and it's like you're stretching yourself too thin, and it's very difficult. And so here I want to see if you sort of maybe agree with that assessment, or you see it differently, as in like the U.S. point of reference might not be accurate, as this is perhaps a unique case and should be treated on its own. So I don't know where you stand on that.
So I could see the connections that you're making, but I think from the differences would be this: the U.S. tried to connect them. Right? The U.S. tried to say, oh, Saddam houses some Al Qaeda guys. So, yeah, because of 9/11, that came out of Afghanistan, supported by Al Qaeda, housed by the Taliban. We're going to go to Iraq and invade and take down Saddam, who was a secular dictator, right? Who actually hated Al Qaeda because he was a threat to him, right? They were a threat to him. Now, I was involved in Operation Viking Hammer, where there was a Al Qaeda linked group called Ansar al-Islam in northeastern Iraq, but that was outside of the control of Sudan, right? So the U.S. attempted to attach the two, and I think history looked at that and said, no, that you guys wanted to use 9/11 to build a coalition to do something you want to do separately, because we didn't finish the job in the 90s or whatever the neoconservatives were thinking there. But I think history will say they weren't linked. You essentially started a war. And I mean, we could go down that rabbit hole of how it's left Iraq, vis-a-vis Iran and all that. But to stay on your point of your question, with Israel's perspective, there is a link. So who is the link? Iran. Iran started Hezbollah. It wasn't just a proxy force. The IRGC Quds Force started Hezbollah. They were the original, founding, fathers of Hezbollah. They supported Hamas. 90% of their military support came from Iran. They support the Houthis, right? And then you could go on to some of the militias in Syria and Iraq. But those three main groups, as you can see right now, were in coordination against Israel. So that's not a coincidence. And I've been going to Israel quite a bit because a lot of our humanitarian efforts about, as you probably know, Jerusalem's a big hub for NGOs. The Israelis have been telling us since November that they expected Lebanon to happen because the Hezbollah has been launching attacks against Israel since October 8th. Right? So 9,000 rockets and missiles, 60,000 Israelis displaced. Their perspective, if anybody was listening to them, and it was from, generals I know down to the bartender who was a reservist that just got back from Gaza, right? And I know a lot of bartenders, I have to tell you. I'm an Irishman. And I usually get my info for them. And they usually have better info, just to be straight up. They were telling me in November, look, as soon as we get Gaza to a place where it's, we think we can, we're going to have to address the northern border, and we're going to have to go in if they don't stop shooting at us, because it's politically impossible to accept that the 1/3 of your country is now off limits to your citizens, right? And so, I mean, you could certainly see it coming, and I think the U.S. has a bit of a different perspective on Hezbollah. One, they've killed more Americans than any other terrorist group other than Al Qaeda. Two, although they have an issue, the U.S. government has an issue, with how the war has been executed in Gaza. There's considerable civilian casualties, and humanitarian aid has had its issues. It's very difficult for the U.S. to say, well, don't invade southern Lebanon, right? Because let's face it, any American would say, like, you can see there's Canada over that mountain.
Oh, yeah.
40 minutes away, right? So right behind me. Now, I don't think Canada's going to start setting rockets and missiles into Montana.
Yeah.
But just hypothetically say they did on October 8th. The U.S. would probably invade on October 9th.
Right.
Right? Let's face it. We all know that to be true. No matter what side of the political aisle you're on, the U.S. would put up with being rocketed from a foreign terrorist group from a neighboring country for like 24 hours. And, the 101st Airborne would be flying over that border. So I'm not being tongue in cheek, right? But it's true.
Yeah.
Like the U.S. to say, oh no, just let 9,000 rockets and missiles land on your settlements in the northern part of your country and just suck it up because we don't want to expand the war. I mean, we can say that, but they can turn around and say, you're full of it. You wouldn't do that. No country would.
Yeah.
So it's difficult. It's difficult for the U.S. they can certainly critique how these conflicts are being executed, particularly in Gaza. 41,000, maybe 42,000 now. If you're tracking the numbers and you believe the Hamas controlled, it's got to be close to that. I think the U.S. believes it's close to that.
Yeah.
You could have the issue there, but to have the issue of them defending themselves is just nonsensical and it's not believable.
Right.
We wouldn't put up with it for a day.
Yeah, and I think there's a good point you make earlier about how the U.S. might have issues with how the Israelis are executing their operation, and they might have reservations about Israelis going into Lebanon, but because it's Hezbollah, that triggers a historical memory, starting from the 80s, right? In the 1982, the Marine Barracks explosion, and then over the years, these different terrorist acts. That puts the U.S. in a very tough spot. It's sort of maybe not the best time to carry out an operation against Hezbollah, but at the same time, the U.S. might feel like, well, at the end of the day, this terrorist entity has done a lot against us, and if this is the opportunity to maybe go after them, I mean, that would probably be the U.S. sort of perspective, and one can understand why that is. It's like you can, it's a rational or logical sort of reaction, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, Fawad Shakur was believed to be one of the main architects behind the Marine barracks bombings that you just referenced. When the Israelis killed him, the first thing most of my friends said, "Wait a minute, he was in Beirut." We've had a $7 million bounty for this guy for how many years? That was 1980, in the early 1980s.
Yeah.
So, for, a lot of, I'm a former Marine, but you don't have to be a former Marine as you just be an American to want to see, like, why was that guy still wandering around in Beirut? Isn't our embassy in Beirut? I mean, it's a little shocking, to be honest. So I think Americans in general, which includes senior policymakers from both sides of the aisle, are a little more hesitant to say, okay, they attacked. I mean, maybe they attacked on October 8th. So it wasn't not that it would ever be really justified, but let's look at that. So it wasn't that Israel went in, was heavy-handed, and that they disagreed with how Israel was prosecuting the war against Hezbollah because it's failing casualties. They started attacking them on October 8th. Like they haven't even recovered from the terrorist attack on October 7th.
Right.
So it had really nothing to do with how Israel was prosecuting the war.
Yeah.
It was like, we're part of the attack on Israel. Essentially, it's the same terrorist attack. So, I've taught, and I have friends on both sides of the aisle. I have friends that were on, I'm not on either side, but were in the Biden administration in my position. Good friends. And most of them, I think, are very consistent in the position I was in, but very consistent with what I'm saying right now.
Right.
I think that is when it comes to Hezbollah, and then of course there's the bit of envy from being a former CIA person who'd seen just the level of decapitation strikes in sequence is astonishing.
Yeah.
Like somebody who has been involved in this from the U.S. side, their ability to find, locate, fix, and finish senior leaders is just astonishing.
Oh yeah,
it is astonishing. It's got to be very worrisome, of course, to Hezbollah or Iran.
Right.
But anyway, there's a multi-facet.
Yeah. No, that's one thing I was really like all of the prominent Hezbollah figures, like the up the chain of command. I mean, all of those were practically eliminated. I mean, that
Yes.
yeah, no, that's a very major. That's I honestly, yeah, I'm astonished as well. I'm like, man, this is fascinating. The level of the targeting, the level of targeted sophisticated targeting, I should probably call it. That's very that's very interesting. And I'd be interested to know how you see the long term or maybe short term impact of these different targeted operations against these figures up the chain of command. Like, where would you see the impact of that short term and long term? With obviously Nasrallah also being assassinated. I mean, that's a big deal. That's also a huge deal. So where do you see sort of what are some of the long term, short term effects of that?
Another good question, Abdullah. I've seen this play out with a lot of policy folks on the discussions of whether decapitation strikes are as effective as some would say.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'd say they never really solve the issue, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, right? So there's several things. One, leadership of any group, even a terrorist group, is important.
Yeah.
People follow them. People take their lead. They make the decisions on whether to stop attacking. They make a decision whether to attack. They make a decision on who to attack. Whether it's let's go after the military targets or let's actually go after civilians. So they're important to remove from the battle space, just like any military commander. I mean, you wouldn't go into war and say, let's leave all the generals, because that would be dumb as hell.
No person ever uttered those words.
Yeah, right. I mean, no, let's just kill the privates. Let's just kill the privates in the fighting positions that have nothing to do with making the decisions or whether they're at war. I mean, nobody would say that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just put that in the same context. Not taking out the leaders is just not smart. The other part is like Safadine, right? So Nasrallah's cousin, who, according to reports, Iran has designated as his replacement since 2006. He has an uncanny resemblance, even speaks like them and all this stuff. Apparently he was killed yesterday.
Oh, yeah. They lost contact with him. There were reports that they lost contact with him. Yeah.
Right. So how many other people are going to be shoving their hands up in the air to be the next Nasrallah? Right. There is a deterrent effect.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, I'm pretty happy being number 4. Number 4 is still on the list, but when you go to number 1, you're on the number 1. You're on the list
exactly
as number 1.
Yeah.
Right. So there's also one. It's like a no-brainer when it comes to tactical is to take a leader out. 2. There is a hesitation, and you can see it, I'm sure, when they're like looking around the room and nobody's holding their hand up, if there's anybody left in the room. And the other part is it is important to show progress militarily, to push diplomacy. People often say, well, only diplomacy matters. Well, I'm here to tell you, if you have no force behind your diplomacy, you have no diplomacy. Nobody cares about the country that has no force to actually impose its policy, its foreign policy, and just shows up to talk diplomacy.
Right.
I mean, just think about it in history.
Yeah.
Right. I do think diplomacy should lead. I do think the military should be there to support diplomacy. But if you don't have the military, I mean, just think about the United States without the United States military.
It's just economy.
Yeah. Just an economy, right? So that's plus. That is a good point.
Yeah.
But how many, are going to really care what we have to say when it comes to war and peace? Right? They're going to be like, whatever, go be Switzerland. So I would say that that falls into it. If we're making strikes, we are not we at all, actually. Israel has Hezbollah shaking their boots right now. Even some of the people I talk about that are close to them and are more inclined to their position are acknowledging it on foreign media.
Yeah.
Like they don't know, to pick up a radio, a pager, a cell phone, because of the military and the covert operations of Mossad, they have them seriously rattled.
Right.
So it is never going to be a be all end all. It should never lead. We should always try to lead with diplomacy, but the military is there to back up diplomacy and give it some actual clout.
Mm.
And I think most diplomats would acknowledge that, if not actually promote it.
And would you think that also applies to ownership or possession of nuclear weapons and its impact or leverage it has over, say, negotiations and diplomacy?
You have good questions. that is kind of a, I don't know if Gordian knot is actually the right. It's a dilemma, right? So I was talking to somebody yesterday, reporter, and I just, they're like, well, will Iran seek a nuclear weapon? And, it's always good to put yourself in their position, even if you don't want to.
Yeah.
If you were Iran right now and you're looking at the Libyan model and the North Korean model, one dude ended up dead in a ditch.
Right.
That was the dude that decided, yeah, I'll give up my nuclear program because the United States asked me to. Yeah. Right. Which I'm happy he did. And I think the United States should have asked him. Mm-hmm. And the other guy is still trouncing around with military parades and fancy trains, right? So,
Rocket Man.
Living the life of luxury, Rocket Man, right? Getting love letters from the President of the United States. So, I wish that wasn't the case, but if just from a purely regime survival perspective, if I was, I won't even put me there, but if I'm sure that the Supreme Leader and the leader of the IRGC is saying, look, if we want to make sure we survive, we got to get to a nuclear weapon. Yeah. Period. It's going to be a totally different dynamic when it comes to, should we take out the entire energy, system in Iran? Should we take out all that stuff is a different calculation when Iran's proven their ability to have a nuclear weapon and deliver it. Mm. It's a horrible thing. The world should not want a nuclear armed Iran. But Iran probably wants a nuclear armed Iran.
Yeah, especially at this stage.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Oof. I don't think there's ever any way to transition to Stoicism or just how does one start a conversation? There's no perfect way to transition to it. Yeah.
The world needs more Stoics. That's my refrain.
Gosh. Yeah. I was, let me ask you this before I start, we can start talking about Stoicism. When was the last time you were in Greece?
So I was there because we did a lot hubbed out of there in Cyprus, by the way. The port that we hubbed out of in Cyprus is called Larnaca. Its historic name is Citium. Oh. Citium was where the founder of Stoicism was actually from. Oh. It's unclear whether he was Phoenician, which is, modern day, I suppose, Lebanon, right, or Greek, but he was, wind me up on Stoicism. He came there. That's where I stayed to help our efforts into Gaza. Yeah. But that was where he's from. He got in a shipwreck off the coast of Piraeus, which is the port city of Athens, swam to shore with nothing. He was a rich guy. Then all of a sudden, all of his stuff went to the bottom of the sea. Oh. And that's where Stoicism started, from a wealthy person who went to nothing and decided that maybe there was more to life than material wealth.
My goodness. Wow.
Yes. So I was in Greece recently.
Oh, yeah.
And Cyprus.
Right.
Greek Cyprus.
It had to do with the floating pier operation, I think. J-Lots.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. We didn't ask for it, but God bless them, they sent it. And the military did Herculean effort to make it successful, and we helped by making sure that it was safely back and forth. I mean, literally physically with our maritime assets, getting it back in port to Ashdod to avoid the weather, and then getting it back in place.
Right.
That's what we did, and we put 1,100 tons of food across it ourselves, or the food that we acquired.
Oh, 1,100 tons from Cyprus. Wow.
From Cyprus, yes. We actually had our logistics officer, Roger, convinced the Cypriot millers, those that make flour, to work on the weekends because they only created enough flour for Cypriots. Like, why would they make?
Yeah.
So we couldn't. They could not feed their own people, so they had to work on all the weekends. And they did. That's how they.
Nice.
It was 1,100 tons primarily of enriched rich flour.
Yeah. Well, that's yeah. So I was reading about what was his name? Epicurus? No, not Epicurus. No, Epicurus would be.
He's a big one.
Yeah, but he wasn't a Stoic.
Enchiridion?
No,
No, he was a Stoic for sure.
Oh, Epicurus.
Epicurus. Oh, Epicurus.
Epicurus,
I would think Epictetus.
Epictetus. Yeah, that's.
Epictetus was a famous Stoic. Yes,
He was born a slave.
Epicurus,
right?
He was an Epictetus was absolutely.
Uh-huh.
In fact, his name really means slave. They don't know his name.
Oh.
Yeah, that's it means one that's owned or something that means slave. So Epictetus is a stalwart of Stoics.
Yeah.
For sure.
Right.
He wrote Enchiridion, the Handbook. But you said Epictetus. Sorry, I just heard
Epicurus.
Epicurean.
Yeah.
Epicurean started another philosophy. All of it comes from the Socratic philosophy.
Right.
So Stoicism does, obviously, Aristotle does, through Plato, and then the Epicureans, the Cynics, for example, and the Cynics were kind of between Socratic philosophy and Stoicism, because Zeno started as a Cynic, and then he basically took that and he offshooted it into Stoicism.
Yeah.
And I'll start with, I've been a lifelong Stoic. I know it's really popular now, but I have been since I was a kid. But I'm not a professional, PhD in philosophy. So
right.
I come at it from the average dude side. But for the average dude, I would say I know a lot about Stoicism because I've been studying it my whole life.
Well, here's one thing that I think that fascinated me about Epictetus. One of his core beliefs is that you don't have sort of control over maybe external events, and you have to accept whatever happens for what it is. Like, just accept it, be patient, and essentially maintain, I guess, a level of self-composure, whatever happens. And he was born into, slavery, but you compare that to the original figure you told me about who founded Stoicism. He was born rich, but then he became poor. And the contrast is that this guy, Epictetus, was born poor, but he accepted it. He was a slave. Obviously, he wouldn't have a lot of, he doesn't come from a family of means or background that's affluent, but he accepted it for what it is. And that, it's interesting that you see a different strand here, right? I mean, I wouldn't say entirely different perspective, but people coming at it from different lifestyles or backgrounds and still sort of, finding a level of connection to the concept. I mean, what do you think of that?
So I think this is, to many, why Stoicism is so attractive. You have Marcus Aurelius, so quite arguably, not only was the most powerful man in the world, but might have been the most powerful man that ever will live. Because we don't have Roman emperors anymore. Right. And yet he spent most of his time not only being a good leader from the front, but us actually troubling himself with being a better person. So when you read the Meditations, it was just his notes to himself. It's not a book. He never intended it to be published. He actually told his staff, burn it. They just didn't. So you have the potentially the most powerful man that ever lived. And who does he study? He studies Epictetus, the slave. Wow. Right. Who does he revere? The slave.
Gosh.
Right. So that's why a lot of people. So, and then another part of this is Zeno, who, as you referenced, was a really wealthy person who then became a really not wealthy person. I'm sure they didn't have insurance back then. He started as a cynic. Cynics, they don't just not value wealth; they just don't like it, or at the time. So they're the guys that lived lived with nothing. They just had a bowl. And then I think he started with that and then said, hey, this only works if other people are willing to give you food. Right. So the Stoics aren't against material things. They realize that's important. They realize that like working is a sense of purpose. Having things is fine,
Yeah.
but it's not who you are, right? That's why you go to a lot of these Stoic conferences, and you'll see, the average guy who, blue collar guy, but you also see millionaires, even billionaires. You see across the spectrum, and it's not that they are opposed to people who, do really well economically for themselves.
Yeah.
But the question then is, the only thing necessary for a good life is to be a good person and do good things. So what is the billionaire doing? Right? If they're just like buying up the next, whatever they're buying, then they're not really. It's called eudaimonia. It's the kind of the good life is just a Greek term for it.
Yeah.
Similar to nirvana, if you have ever studied Buddhism. Similar.
Yeah, I've heard some people saying you
Yeah.
die. My professor used to say you're daimonia. I was like, how's that even? What's
He's
the right?
probably saying it right? Because most of mine is
Okay.
from reading.
It's all right.
It's from reading, and I've talked to a lot of Greeks about this, and they pronounce it different than both, right?
Oh.
Because it's Greek and they're speaking Greek.
Right.
But the point being is there's nothing wrong with wealth, but it really is, whether you have $1 in your bank account or $1 billion, to a Stoic, one isn't a better person than the other. It just isn't. It depends on what you're doing.
Yeah.
And which and so that's now Stoicism really started with multifacets, propositional logic, virtue ethics, the Stoic ethics, all the cardinal virtues and such, and this strong belief that you should live in compliance, if you will, with nature.
That's right. Yeah.
Today, it's mostly focused on the virtue ethics part, which is fine, but it always has been, and in concert with nature also includes this really strong belief that you should lead with science, the natural sciences, right? Not everybody should be a scientist necessarily. And interesting enough, my dad was a scientist. I think that's one of the reasons why he taught me virtue ethics through Stoicism.
Oh, wow.
But anyway,
Yeah.
that was what Stoicism was usually founded much broader in terms of what they were interested in. Now it's mostly virtue ethics, but I think that's important too.
One of the interesting things I read was that when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and then obviously became sort of like the state religion, right? The Stoic philosophy, or Stoics in general, started sort of fizzling away with the emergence of Christianity and it being a state religion. So you have people sort of betting on or switching. Well, maybe they still remain Stoics, but they're essentially Christian, and they believe in in their salvation through Christ, and that is what they've dedicated their lives toward. And you see how, I guess today, there's a resurgence of Stoicism, and you wonder sometimes why that is. Right in the beginning, back in the 4th century, right, 3rd century. I think that's when Constantine was emperor. That's when it sort of started fizzling away a little bit. But then today, you see a resurgence, and I wonder what you would attribute the reasons to that for such resurgence.
You know your stuff. You really do know your stuff. I think
a little bit of preparation.
Like most of, you did a lot of preparation. So if you think about Paul, and he went around all these Greek settlements, most of them were Stoics that he was preaching Christianity to.
Right.
Now, there's nothing in Stoicism, to my knowledge, and again, I'm not Princeton professor of philosophy or anything. There's nothing in Stoicism that you can be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and be a Stoic.
Yeah.
In fact, if we back up a bit, the early Stoics believed in God. You don't have to be a Stoic. You can be atheist too, by the way, or agnostic or whatever. But the early Stoics definitely believed in God, but they believed in a God that I think most people would say is a more modern interpretation.
Okay.
The one my dad described it, who, by the way, was a Jesuit priest before he became a scientist.
Oh.
Where my dad described it, most religions view God as the watchmaker, whereas Stoics viewed God as the watch. If you can get the example. Like, in other words, God is the composition of everything. That's essentially what early Stoics believed in.
Right.
It was God was the sum of all parts, and the all parts was everything in the universe.
Interesting.
Right. So rather than some separate entity that created, that's the watchmaker. At least what my dad used to explain it. It worked for me. But when Paul and other apostles were preaching, they were preaching to a lot of Stoics. But the Stoicism was primarily not a religion. It's not a religion. And it's not necessarily in opposition, but I do think you're right. I think a lot of them, they're like, oh, like eternal salvation, heaven, all these things. Stoicism doesn't really promise anything. So I can see why that would be a draw, of course, and still is. And I know plenty of, especially Catholics, but I know plenty of Christian Stoics. It's very much in line. And early Christianity's philosophy was heavily influenced by Stoicism. In fact, there was Christians who even pretended to be Zeno and to be Epictetus and wrote all these treaties under their name that they now have, and they call the false Zeno and all stuff like that. I don't think it was done maliciously, but it was a way to kind of bring the two together because they're very conducive. Jesus, whether you are Christian or just look at him as a historical figure, was all about doing good deeds and being a good person. Right. That's Stoicism too. Right. So I think that, and then of course during the Renaissance, the Renaissance was bringing back a lot of these ancient philosophical Greek doctrines, from Socrates to all that, and then merging it into, at that time, modern Christian thought. That's the Renaissance. So there's always, and Gilbert Murray said, the historian said, essentially after Alexander, every one of his successors considered himself a Stoic. So there was a time when it was like, of course I'm a Stoic. That's Western philosophy. That's what we do, right? Anyway, but now it's making a resurgence, which is really good. And I know a lot of the guys and gals, from Ryan Holiday, I've been on his podcast, The Daily Stoic, to Donald Robertson, who writes often about Marcus Aurelius and Socrates, but Stoic, and then Nancy Sherman, that Georgetown professor who wrote The Stoic Warrior, and there's people like that leading the charge, and I think it's a great thing. People are like, oh, now it's becoming trendy. It's like, look, man, there's a lot of things to become trendy that are worse than Stoicism. Like, oh, it's trendy to be, to hold wisdom and justice and courage and self-discipline. If that's what kids are doing nowadays, like let's promote it. So anyway, I think it's a good thing that modern Stoicism is taken off.
One thing you mentioned earlier, and I'd love to maybe highlight, is you said that some early Christians would perhaps write something in the name of, I don't know, a famous Stoic. I think that's something called, I think, a pseudepigraphy, right? When you write something and you try to impersonate a famous figure, you try to do that because people will probably believe this more since it was written by, famous figure, but obviously it wasn't. And that happens a lot in the ancient world, I think. But another thing you mentioned, and something else I love you brought up is the influence, right, on Christianity, Stoicism, or maybe even the ancient Greek world might have had a little bit of an influence. And I think one element, and I think maybe that's something you can speak through, is the idea of the separation of the soul and the body. Because I think in the earlier before the emergence of Christianity, I think Jewish people, who also, some of them converted after the emergence of Jesus, believed in the union of the body and the soul. Like these two are not separate. But then afterward, and obviously they believed in the idea of the resurrection, where the body rises back up. And so, with the influence of the ancient Greeks on the Christianity, there's the idea of the separation of the body and the soul. So the soul is independent or a different entity than the body. And I don't know if that's something you notice or something you can speak to, like this level of influence.
Sure. And to start with one of your points on your first is about historical documents not being written by the actual person. I mean, that's most of the Gospels.
Mm.
I'm sure my wife didn't hear me on that.
Let's keep it down.
But it's true. I mean, you look at most historians, just Google the key Gospels, and you'll see that historically that they were written long after
Mm.
the actual listed apostle was no longer with us.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they didn't carry down the stories. But anyway, to your point, I think there's always been an evolution of religion and science, right? So the more we know, the more we adapt our beliefs as a group,
Yeah.
not just one particular sect or anything like that. I mean, think about it. There was a time when religious figures said the Earth was the center of the universe.
Mm.
Had to be,
Yep.
right? I mean, it was us, just us. Everything else didn't matter. That evolved, Copernicus. I mean, we could just go down the list,
Yeah.
and eventually, science figures it out, and the church finally goes, "Okay, you're right. We're not the center of the universe. Okay, we're not the center of this. You're not even center of the solar system.
Right.
Okay, and then Hubble. I mean, why does it name the
Hubble telescope.
telescope after him? It's because he figured out we're not even. I mean, one galaxy.
Right.
There's billions of galaxies. So, the reason why I bring that up is you eventually learn, look, the body decays. It's a natural process. It doesn't, the question then becomes about the soul. Is the soul separate? And if the soul's separate, then you can still see how it could eventually join something else or be everlasting. Yeah. It's up to people to make a decision. But I think it's pretty clear just from science, if you dug up, a grave, that you could see what actually happens to the body. It's a natural process that, in a way, you could look at it as regenerative, right? Everything's regenerative. You want to look at it that way. But as far as the soul, it doesn't necessarily answer the question of what happens to the soul.
Mm. Yeah, but I think it's.
I think early Stoics, for that matter, would have claimed that it became part of the bigger entity that was, in their terms, God.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get too far into that because that's somebody who studied Stoicism at its very roots.
Yeah.
And not just the guys that it's a hobby.
Right. But I think for the most
part, a big one.
Yeah. Yeah. For the most part, I think it's all, with ancient Greek philosophy, there's a heavy emphasis on sort of feeding the soul or the mind, right? You love of wisdom. I mean, or seeking wisdom, or trying to essentially not necessarily seek gratification, but you're trying to feed something else, something intrinsic or something metaphysical in a way. It's not necessarily the body; it's something else. So there's also that heavy emphasis, and so it seems to be important.
I'm gonna steal that next time. I'm gonna steal that. Was good. Yeah.
No, I'm learning from you. I just try to keep up.
That was well put.
Yeah, but essentially, I think there's a great deal of emphasis on the soul as well back then. Because they seem to think that,
sure,
it's more than just your body; it's something else. Which I think even today, it's a prevalent, common theme of wanting to seek something more that transcends instant gratification in a way.
Yeah, I think while you're here on Earth, and hopefully, for most people, a lot of people, the idea that something comes after.
Yeah.
And for that person, for you, not just, for existence, which obviously something comes after. That's the question. That's the eternal. I don't know that any philosophy answers the question, or religion. I guess for some people in the religion it does. But the philosophy is more about the question than necessarily the answer. It is, like you already said, a lover of wisdom. That's literally what philosophy means, right? Yeah. So it's a person who continuously seeks the answer, but maybe would also be the person that accepts that there isn't a definitive answer, at least not for people here on Earth.
Yeah. What do you, have you reached that limit of words for the day, or Uh,
Yeah, Abdullah, I told for people who are listening, I told Abdullah that as you get to be an older man, I think probably it might be gender related. You get a word count, and when you hit the word count, you just kind of stop talking.
yeah, we don't want you to reach
I
that
don't know. Is it
point.
just me? I don't know. Like, put a comment in the thing whether it's just me, but I've heard other older men refer to this phenomenon,
Uh,
or you just run out of words for the day. No, I'm not there yet. I could keep talking.
yeah, no, I figured ask a couple more questions and see where, and then we can, wrap up this great conversation. Is there a way where you see maybe, and this goes back earlier to our, I guess the beginning of our conversation, is there hope that you have for de-escalation in the region at this stage? Obviously, Israel is involved with Iran. Iran is also there's a back and forth between the two countries. Israel is involved in Lebanon and Gaza. It seems to be, I don't want to say getting out of hand, but it's somewhere in that realm of
Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know. What sort of hope do you have for de-escalation?
So that's certainly a fair question. The issue, as I see it, is tied to the discussion we had early on. What's the plan for the next step?
Mm.
Because if there's no pathway to that, then I think a lot of the groups involved, whether it's obviously Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, um, view it as like, this is what we do. We just fight. We just fight. I don't think Israel thinks that way, but the other groups, their existence. I mean, look at the Houthis, death to Israel, death to the U.S. I mean, it's the whole point of their existence.
Right.
So I don't know if we can get them off of that, but certainly if you create a political situation where, in this case, Palestinians feel like they have a future, that they can safely exist, that they can educate their children and have an economic path forward, then I think the idea that they would be resisting what? You just, embrace your own future.
Yeah.
The groups that, basically benefit by keeping them in this perpetual state of conflict will never agree, but maybe ultimately there's more regular people than there are militants or terrorists. That's one way to get it, is for this isn't just philosophical, like political, like people have to actually throw in money.
Mm.
Like it's going to take $50 billion, I heard at one of the conferences I was at, to rebuild Gaza in 10 to 15 years, if that, maybe 20. So it's going to be more than rhetoric. It's going to be more than tweets, harsh tweets from the UN. It's going to be like a all-out concerted effort to change the current situation and to ensure that Israel feels safe, which they don't, with a lot of the rhetoric coming from countries and, quite frankly, the UN.
Mm.
So there's a lot of people that are really comfortable being on a political side, one or the other, but are doing almost nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, really, almost nothing. Tweets don't count. And so, I mean, for example, this is an example. It's a small one, but I'll throw it out there. There's a lot of people that are very rightfully concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And then when the U.S. pushed a pier from Virginia to Gaza, cost them $230 million, all they did was criticize.
Mm.
My question is, what the hell are you doing? Right? So there's plenty of things to be critical of the pier, but you're sitting on the sidelines and having conferences about how terrible the situation is, tweeting about how terrible it is, passing resolutions about how terrible is nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, we could tie this into Stoicism.
Right.
It isn't just saying one of Aurelius's most famous quotes is, enough about talking about what it is to be a good man, be one. Enough of talking about what it is to be a good country, be one.
I'm going to start
right?
using
So
that.
there's a lot of rhetoric and very little action by countries around the world. And I think, I'm getting on a soapbox here, but I think that's part of the solution is, okay, so how much are you willing to throw in to reconstruct Gaza? How much are you willing to put in your political capital to push all sides of the conflict to get to a political and diplomatic solution? Because the answer is nothing. then it's not the critic that counts. It's the country and the arena, to use another quote from a Stoic, right? So Teddy Roosevelt. See, I can always go back to Stoicism. Yeah. Teddy Roosevelt used to carry around copies of the notebook or the handbook by Epictetus. In fact, they brought it on his famous trip down the Amazon.
Oh,
but right. So, but that's a quote that's also relevant.
Yeah.
It's not the critic that counts. It's in his case, he said the man in the arena.
I like that.
Win or lose. There's a lot of groups, countries, people around the world that love talking about their political opinion, but don't do much to actually change the situation. So I think the biggest thing is it's going to be an international effort on multiple facets of this to change the situation so that this isn't a recurring cycle of violence and conflict.
Mm. And one other thing that you mentioned also in the beginning is you mentioned there's, I don't know if I'm phrasing it right, but for most of the time, policies don't change, and we don't really talk about them because there's nothing to talk about because this policy didn't change. And here, I mean, in your opinion, do you see that as a good thing or a bad thing? And is it even accurate to say that it's binary? It's either good or bad, or is there sort of middle ground?
Yeah, so it's another good question. So I do think it's why didn't it change? So if it is reviewed and says, well, that's still in the interest of the United States, don't change it. Don't change it just because you're a Democrat that came in and the before guy was a Republican, or vice versa, which happens.
Right.
Like, well, I disagree with it. Why? Because Obama agreed with it, or Trump agreed with it, or whatever. Right. So, I mean, if that's the case, that's a bad reason to change the policy. Obviously, it's about politics and not policy. Yeah. If it is not, I mean, things do change, circumstances do change, allies become adversaries, not much, but adversaries certainly become allies, right? I mean, think of Japan and Germany, right? Mm-hmm. They're some of our closest allies. So we have to change our policies when the circumstances changes. But if it doesn't, it's still in our interest. Leave it. I mean, that's one of the things that it's important to point out is if you change things just because it's the other guy, then nobody wants to enter in agreements with us. Yeah. Because I mean, when you think about it, I mean, I rarely look at things from Iran's perspective. But they're like, hey, we entered the JCPOA. You had all these other countries that did. You just unilaterally withdrew from it, primarily because it was a different political party in your own system that agreed with it. I'm not saying it was a perfect agreement, but if you don't try to make it better and maintain our pledge as a country, then why the hell would they enter in again?
Exactly.
I mean, they're just like, look, you're going to change it in 4 years. What's the point of spending 2 years negotiating it? And again, I'm no fan at all of Iran, and I'm pretty hawkish on Iran. But whether it's Iran or not, if we don't have some consistency in our foreign policy, unless it's a treaty, which is really hard to break, but also really hard to get, mm-hmm. and rarely happens, if there isn't a agreement collectively among Republicans and Democrats and independents, for that matter, hey, man, you got to really have a reason to break an agreement or nobody's going to come to any agreements with us. They're just not, because they just don't trust us. Anyway, I won't belabor that, but that's one reason why I think this concept of U.S. foreign policy or politics, U.S. politics ending at the water's edge, a famous quote by Senator Vandenberg, should be the policy going forward. But it seems like we're going away from it. It's like politics is infused in every aspect of everything that we do now, and that is not healthy, and it's not in our own national security.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Mick, thank you for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'm glad we did it.
Yeah, thanks, Abdullah. It was a great conversation. Absolutely, man.
Yeah.
Great talking to you.
Absolutely.
And I'm glad we got to touch on the Stoicism.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that didn't, some video's not going to be published, but for those who couldn't see it, your cute little dog approached us and, or approached you and decided to sleep next to you. So, yeah.
Yes. Not everybody calls her cute little. She is a half German Shepherd and half Belgian Malinois. So the ultimate military dog. But
Yeah.
She's a sweetheart, but she'll also go against a bear for you. So
Oh
it
gosh.
has here in the backyard.
Wow.
So yeah,
That's
Finley,
awesome.
Finley. It actually is Irish for courageous one.
Finley. I like that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Mick. That was wonderful. You got a trip going on, so I don't want to keep you in here for, a long time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great questions, man. You did great prep work, man. Seriously, I do a lot of these, and I get interviewed a lot. You well done.
Thank you.